Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets on that January night, as Scarlet Hayes held her two small children tight against her chest, trying to shield them from the skin-cutting cold of Chicago. Her daughter, Sophie, trembled inside a coat so thin the wind slipped through every seam, and Ethan, the 4-year-old boy, kept coughing into his mother's shoulder, each rasping cough sounding like it might tear his tiny chest apart. They sat curled beneath the overhang of the Obsidian nightclub, the kind of place where powerful people walked by without sparing a glance. Inside that lavish club, on the highest level, Marcus Blackwood stood behind a one-way pane of glass and looked down. People called him the Shadow King, the Dark King of Chicago's underworld. And in 12 years of ruling, he had learned only one lesson: never trust anyone. 12 years of watching allies turn their backs. 12 years of seeing blood spilled for greed. 12 years of believing everyone had a price. That kindness was only a mask people wore until they got what they wanted. His father taught him that with the lash. His ex-wife taught him that with betrayal. She sold information to his enemies, nearly got him killed, then vanished with $10 million. The men he once called brothers taught him that too, with bullets aimed at his back. So when he stepped out of the club and saw Scarlet with her two children, what rose in his chest wasn't pity. It wasn't compassion. It was a darker kind of curiosity. He wanted to prove his own theory true. He wanted evidence that people, when given the chance, would always choose themselves. Even the mothers who looked the most saintly. What he didn't know was this homeless woman would spend the next 24 hours shattering everything he thought he understood about human nature. She would make choices so pure, so unself-conscious, that the coldest mafia boss in Chicago would be brought to his knees, weeping. But the real shock didn't come from what she bought. It came from what happened afterward, when the truth was dragged into the light, when Marcus discovered the horrifying secret behind her husband's death and the direct connection to his own empire. When hearts broke, then somehow mended again, and when love proved it was stronger than bullets and blood. This is a story about an unlimited credit card, a ruthless test, and two people from opposite worlds finding each other in a way no one could have predicted. A story about a devil learning how to love and an angel learning how to forgive. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, please tap like to support this story. Share the video to spread the message to more people. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you don't miss stories that reach straight into the heart like this one. Scarlet Hayes wasn't always homeless. 2 years earlier, she was a nurse at Chicago Memorial Hospital, working in the emergency department, where she watched death and life twist around each other every day. She loved her work. She loved the feeling of helping someone. She loved the grateful look in patients' eyes when they woke up and saw her standing by the bed. Her husband, Daniel Hayes, was a police officer with the Chicago Police Department, a man so upright his co-workers used to tease him, calling him the last fool who still believed in justice. Daniel never took a bribe. He never looked the other way when he saw crime. And he never stopped believing the law could protect the innocent. They lived in a small apartment out in the suburbs, not wealthy, but with enough. Sophie was 4 then. Ethan was 2. And every night, Daniel read the children a story before bed. It was a normal life, simple and steady, and Scarlet used to think it would last forever. Then, on a March night, everything collapsed. Daniel was investigating a major case tied to organized crime. He didn't tell Scarlet much because he didn't want her to worry. He only said it was the most important case of his career. That night, he drove home after a late shift. The police told Scarlet he'd lost control on an empty stretch of road, hit the median barrier, and rolled over several times. Daniel died at the scene. They called it an accident, but Scarlet knew how carefully her husband drove. She knew he never drank when he had to get behind the wheel. She knew something was wrong, but no one listened to a widow drowning in grief. After Daniel's death, tragedy piled on tragedy. The hospital where they tried to save him sent a bill for $180,000 for surgeries and emergency resuscitation, even though he only lived 4 more hours on the operating table. His life insurance money was withheld because the accident was still being investigated further, an investigation that seemed like it would never end. Scarlet tried to keep working, but the pain of losing him left her unable to focus. She made a mistake, a small mistake, but enough for the hospital to fire her for not ensuring patient safety. With no job, no insurance, and that massive debt pressing down on her shoulders, she lost the apartment after only 6 months. She sold everything, moved into a cheaper room, then lost that room too. In 18 months, Scarlett went from a respected nurse to a homeless mother, surviving on shelters and the overhangs of strangers. Sophie, now 6, had grown old before her time. She no longer asked for toys. She no longer cried when she was hungry. She only watched her mother in silence, with eyes too deep for her age. She learned not to complain. She learned to give her share of food to her little brother. She learned to pretend she wasn't cold when the wind slipped through her thin coat. Ethan, on the other hand, was often sick. The small body of a 4-year-old boy couldn't endure the cold and the lack of everything. He coughed all night, and every cough felt like a blade cutting into Scarlett's heart. Tonight, they came to the Obsidian not because they wanted to. The Mercy Street shelter was full, and the snowstorm arrived earlier than the forecast. Scarlett walked 5 blocks, carrying Ethan in her arms and leading Sophie beside her, searching for any place with a roof. The Obsidian's overhang was wider and more protected from the wind than most places, enough for a mother and her 2 children to hide under for the night. She didn't know this was the lair of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. She didn't know there was a man standing on the top floor, looking down at her the way someone studies a lab rat. She only knew her children were cold, hungry, and sick, and she would do anything to keep them alive through tonight. Marcus Blackwood had been standing behind the one-way glass for nearly an hour, the whiskey in his hand long since gone cold. He watched the woman and her 2 children below, studied the way she pulled them tight every time the wind surged, the way she took off her own coat to cover the little boy who kept coughing. His security team had asked twice whether they should chase them off, and both times he'd ordered them to leave them alone, not out of pity, but because he was thinking. He was laying out a small experiment, a game where only he knew the rules. At last, Marcus set the glass down on the table and walked out of his office. Tony, his right-hand man, looked up in surprise when he saw Marcus heading toward the elevator instead of the VIP exit. Marcus didn't explain. He never explained. The club doors opened, and the January cold hit like a slap. Marcus stepped down the front steps, his expensive leather shoes leaving prints in the white snow. He walked straight toward the overhang, where Scarlett sat curled up with her children. The distance between them closed, and when he was only a few steps away, Scarlett looked up. Her green eyes met his cold, black gaze, and in the next instant she sprang to her feet. A mother's instinct. With one hand she pulled Sophie behind her, with the other she hugged Ethan tight to her chest, turning her own thin body into a wall between her children and the unfamiliar man. "We'll leave right away," Scarlett said, her voice shaking, but not from the cold. "I'm sorry to bother you." Marcus didn't answer at once. He stood there, looking her up and down. The thin coat, worn to the threads, the shoes with holes at the toes, the auburn, brown hair blown into a tangle by the wind, still unable to hide her pale, hollow face. She looked like a stray cat ready to claw anyone who dared get near her young. He could see it in her eyes, the wariness, the suspicion, and something that felt like pride, the kind poor people weren't supposed to have, but she was holding on to it anyway. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, his voice low and cold as the winter night. Scarlett blinked, not expecting that to be his first question. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm about to give you this." Marcus slid his hand into the pocket of his cashmere coat and pulled out a card. Not an ordinary card, a solid black one, the kind only a few hundred people in the world possessed, the kind with no spending limit, the kind that could buy anything money could buy. He held it up between 2 fingers, the club lights catching on its surface, glittering like an invitation from the devil. Scarlett looked at the card, then back at Marcus. She didn't reach for it. Instead, her eyes darkened, and when she spoke, her voice was colder than the snow-filled wind. "I don't sell my body." Marcus was surprised enough that he almost let it show. In 12 years as king of the underworld, he'd met every kind of person, the ones who would drop to their knees and beg, the ones who pretended to have pride and still took the money behind your back, the ones who said no while their eyes screamed yes. But this woman, This homeless mother, shaking in a snowstorm with two sick, hungry children, looked at him like he was trash beneath her heel. "You've misunderstood," Marcus said, a thin, blade-sharp smile appearing on his lips. "I'm not buying you. I'm giving it to you. 24 hours. Spend whatever you want. No limit. No conditions." "There's no such thing as no conditions," Scarlett shot back, her gaze still fixed on the card while her arms stayed locked around her child. "Especially not from men like you. Men who stand up high and look down at other people like toys." Marcus felt a flicker of enjoyment run along his spine. It had been a long time since anyone had dared speak to him like that. It had been a long time since he'd met someone who made him want to know more. "You're different from the ones I've met," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Most people would snatch that card before I could finish the sentence. I'm not most people." Ethan coughed, a deep, rough sound cutting through the tension between them. Scarlett turned and looked down at him, and in that moment Marcus saw the crack in her mask of pride. He saw the pain, he saw the desperation, he saw a mother standing on the edge of a cliff, still forcing herself to balance, because there was no one else for her children to hold on to. "The boy needs medicine," Marcus said, not a question but a certainty. "You need someplace warm tonight. You need food, clothes, and 100 other things you don't have the money to buy." He stepped one pace closer and placed the card into her hand before she could react. 24 hours. After that, the card will deactivate on its own. You can use it or throw it away. The choice is yours. Scarlett felt the card in her palm, weightless and yet heavy with meaning. She wanted to fling it back in his face. She wanted to prove she didn't need anyone's pity, that her dignity had no price. But then Sophie tugged at her hand, the little girl's voice small in the night. "Mom, Ethan's so cold." And Scarlett's pride broke apart at those 3 words. She remembered something her mother had told her before she died, that refusing help while your child was suffering wasn't strength. It was another kind of selfishness. Scarlett looked down at Ethan, shaking, looked at Sophie trying to be brave, then looked back at the black card in her trembling hand. "I'll pay you back," she said, her voice raw. "Somehow. I don't take handouts." Marcus nodded and stepped back. 24 hours, starting now. He turned and walked away, leaving Scarlett standing there with the black card shaking in her hand. She didn't know every transaction would be tracked. She didn't know this was a test. She only knew that in her hand she held something that could save her children through tonight. And for a mother, that was enough. Scarlett stood still beneath the overhang, watching the silhouette of the unfamiliar man fade behind the club doors. The black card lay in the center of her palm, no heavier than a leaf, and yet it carried the weight of the whole world pressing down on her chest. She wanted to run after him and throw it back. She wanted to shout that she didn't need anyone's pity, that she'd taken care of herself and her children for 2 years without the handouts of the rich. Pride inside her screamed, demanded that she drop this card into the snow and walk away as if it had never existed. But then Ethan coughed again, a sound that tore through the night and tore through her heart with it. Sophie tightened her grip on her mother's hand, small fingers frozen stiff like popsicles, and Scarlett faced a bitter truth she had tried to deny for 6 months, that pride couldn't warm her children, couldn't buy medicine for Ethan, couldn't trade for a hot meal or a night of sleep beneath warm blankets. She closed her eyes, and her mother's face rose in her mind. Eleanor, the woman who had raised Scarlett alone in the slums on Chicago's South Side, the woman who never had much money but always had more than enough love to give away. When Scarlett was little, on a winter night when the 2 of them had to accept donated food just to get through the day, Eleanor had told her that taking help didn't mean weakness, that knowing how to bow your head when it was necessary was real strength, that refusing an outstretched hand while your child was suffering wasn't pride at all, it was selfishness. "When a blessing comes to you," Eleanor had said, her voice warm as a fire in a hearth, "let it flow through you to someone else. Don't ever be the stopping place for kindness, my girl. Be the bridge that carries it farther." Scarlett opened her eyes and looked down at the card again. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know why he had given her this. Maybe it was a trap. Maybe he wanted something from her she didn't understand yet. But right now, in this freezing snow-filled night, She didn't have the strength left for suspicion. Her children needed her, and she would do anything, even swallow her pride, to keep them safe. "Mom," Sophie's voice came, pulling Scarlett back into the present. The little girl stared at the card in her mother's hand with wide eyes. "What is that?" Scarlett knelt down until she was level with her daughter. She gently smoothed Sophie's messy blonde hair, feeling the snow caught there melt beneath the warmth of her hand. She wanted to lie, wanted to say it was nothing, but she'd promised herself she would never lie to her children. Daniel had taught her that. That truth was the foundation of every relationship, even with kids. "It's hope, sweetheart," Scarlett whispered, her voice thick. "It's a chance for us to have one warm night." Sophie looked at her mother, then at the card, then back at her mother again. The understanding in the eyes of a 6-year-old made Scarlett's heart ache. No child should be that old inside. No child should understand deprivation that deeply. "Come on, Mom," Scarlett said as she stood and lifted Ethan into her arms. "We need to find a pharmacy." They started walking through the snow, and as they went, Scarlett's mind began to move in a different direction. She thought of Margaret at the Mercy Street shelter, the woman who had given Sophie part of her own blanket on the coldest nights. She thought of Harold, the 73-year-old veteran, forced to choose between his diabetes medicine and food each month because he couldn't afford both. She thought of the Morrison family, Linda and her 3 small children, facing eviction from their rented apartment because they were short on money. She thought of all the people who had helped her over the last 6 months, people worse off than she was, and yet still willing to share what little they had. 24 hours. No limit. That man had said it. Scarlett didn't know if he meant it, but if it was true, what could she do in 24 hours? How many people could she help? How many lives could she change? For the first time in months, a faint light flickered in Scarlett Hayes' eyes. Not the light of hope for herself alone, but hope for everyone she loved. Marcus stepped back into the club. The thick glass doors closed behind him, cutting off the bite of the winter night. Inside, soft jazz still played, and warm golden light spilled over expensive suits and glittering glasses of liquor. But Marcus didn't see any of it. His mind was still caught on the green eyes of the woman outside, on the way she looked at him as if he were an enemy, on the words "I don't sell my body," spoken in a voice cold as ice. He went straight to the bar, gave the bartender a brief nod, and within seconds a glass of whiskey was in his hand. He took a sip, let the amber burn slide down his throat, then pulled out his phone and called Tony. Tony Russo appeared in less than 2 minutes, moving fast through the crowd with worry on his face. He'd been Marcus's right hand for 8 years, the only person Marcus almost trusted, if the word trusted still meant anything in a mafia boss's dictionary. Tony was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cut black hair and brown eyes that never stopped scanning. He came to a halt in front of Marcus and waited. "The black card I just gave that woman outside," Marcus said, his voice low and even. "I want every transaction tracked, every single dollar, every single location, every single time. Report to me immediately." Tony frowned. "That homeless woman? You gave her a black card?" "No limit. 24 hours. Tony went quiet for a moment, as if he were trying to understand what his boss was doing. Then he asked, carefully, "Can I ask why, boss?" Marcus looked at him, a cold smile forming on his mouth. "A small experiment. I want to see what she does with unlimited money, what she buys, where she goes, who she becomes when she thinks no one is watching. And what do you think she'll do?" Marcus gave a short, contemptuous laugh and leaned back against the bar stool. "Like everyone else. She'll run straight to the designer shops on Michigan Avenue. Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton. She'll book a room at the Four Seasons or the Ritz-Carlton, the most expensive suite they've got. She'll eat dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant, order Dom Perignon champagne and Wagyu beef. And when the 24 hours are almost up, she'll try to pull out cash, hide as much as she can before the card locks." Tony shook his head slightly. "Didn't you see the way she looked at the kids?" She took off her own coat to cover the boy. "In 10 Below. Maybe she's not like the people you've met. Everyone has a price, Tony." Marcus's voice cooled, as if he were reciting a law that couldn't be broken. "Everyone. It's only the number that changes. Some people sell themselves for $100. Some people need $1 million. But in the end, when they've got enough money in their hands, people show who they really are. People choose themselves. Tony didn't answer. He knew there was no point arguing with Marcus about this. The boss had been betrayed too many times to believe in human kindness. Victoria, his ex-wife, had taken not only $10 million, but his ability to trust. The men he'd grown up with in the underworld had taken his faith in friendship. His father had taken his faith in family when he was still a child. Marcus Blackwood didn't hate people. He simply didn't have any hope left for them. "Set up the tracking system," Marcus ordered. "I want real-time notifications for every transaction." Tony nodded and withdrew. Marcus turned back to his whiskey, staring out through the glass, where snow was still falling into the darkness. The woman and her 2 children were gone from the overhang. The game had begun, and Marcus Blackwood sat there, waiting, ready to be proven right once again about the true nature of humanity. Scarlett stepped into the 24-hour pharmacy on Clark Street, the door chime ringing out to announce her arrival. The harsh, white fluorescent lights stung her eyes after so many hours in darkness and snow. Sophie held tight to her mother's hand, while Ethan sagged against her shoulder, his breath wheezing, hot against the side of her neck. The night pharmacist looked at them with an expression that was part curiosity, part pity. 3 soaked, ragged figures, clearly people with nowhere to go. Scarlett didn't care about that look. She went straight to the counter, set Ethan down on a chair, and started naming what she needed. Children's cough medicine, the best they had. Fever reducer, multivitamins, prescription antibiotics she knew Ethan needed, but she'd never been able to afford. She'd been a nurse. She knew exactly what her child needed. Then she stopped and thought of Harold, the old veteran who had given Sophie half of his last piece of bread the week before, even though he was hungry too. He was diabetic and had to choose between medicine and food every month. Scarlett remembered the name of the medication he took. She had seen the box in his coat pocket more than once. She turned to the pharmacist and read out the name, asking for enough to last 6 months. The pharmacist stared at her, startled, but didn't ask questions. He simply went to get it. When Scarlett handed over the black card to pay, the pharmacist looked at it for a moment, then swiped it. The screen showed $847, and the transaction was approved. Scarlett let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. At least this part was real. Half a city away, in the luxurious office of the Obsidian, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw the first transaction notification. CVS Pharmacy, Clark Street, $847. His brow tightened slightly. Medicine. She bought medicine. Maybe it was expensive cosmetics, he told himself. High-end skincare, designer lipstick, the kind women like to buy in pharmacies. He set the phone down and kept sipping his whiskey, waiting for the next transaction. Scarlett walked her children 3 more blocks through the snow, the bag of medicine swinging against her shoulder. She found a small motel, the cheap kind working people stayed in, not the 5-star kind the rich imagined the poor would dream about. A flickering red vacancy sign burned in the darkness. She stepped inside, set Ethan down on the bench in the lobby, and asked for the cheapest room. $79 for 1 night, including hot water and heat. Scarlett nodded and handed over the card. The transaction went through. Marcus's phone buzzed the second time. He looked at the screen and nearly spilled his whiskey. Lucky Star Motel, $79. He read the line again and again, as if his eyes were lying to him. $79. She had an unlimited card in her hand. She could book the presidential suite in any hotel in the city, and she chose a $79 motel. He called Tony over and pointed at the phone screen. "Explain this to me," Marcus said, his voice edged with disbelief. Tony looked at the screen, then at his boss. He didn't say anything, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe curiosity, maybe something close to hope that he didn't dare admit. "Maybe she's testing the limits of the card," Marcus said, as if he were trying to convince himself. "Starting with small things before she moves on to something bigger. That's a smart tactic." Tony stayed quiet. The third transaction arrived 10 minutes later. McDonald's, $15.67. Marcus stared at the number, then at Tony, then back at the number. $15. he said slowly, as if he were trying to process something beyond his ability to understand. She has my black card, and she buys $15 of fast food. Tony gave a small shrug. Maybe she doesn't know how the card works. Or maybe... He stopped, weighing whether to say it. Maybe she really is different from the people you've met. Marcus shook his head and set his whiskey down harder than he needed to. We'll see. The night is still young, and I've never been wrong about people. He said it with absolute certainty, but deep in his chest, something began to stir. Something he thought had died a long time ago. A thin, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. In the warm, cramped motel room, Scarlett sat on the edge of the bed and watched her children eat hamburgers and fries as if it were the richest feast they'd ever seen. Sophie pushed part of her fries toward Ethan, and Ethan laughed, a clear sound threaded with coughing. Scarlett didn't eat. She just sat there watching them. And for the first time in months, she felt something that looked almost like peace. After the children finished eating, Scarlett led them into the bathroom. The space was cramped, with old tile and a shower head streaked with rust. But to Scarlett it looked like a palace. She turned the hot water on and waited, watching steam rise in a soft haze, feeling warmth spread through the tight little room. How long had it been since she'd had a hot shower? How long had it been since her children had felt warm water running over their skin? She couldn't remember. In the shelter, hot water was a luxury divided by the hour, and mothers with small children often gave up their turn for someone else. And on the nights they slept outside, the only water they had was melted snow in their hair. Scarlett stripped off Sophie's and Ethan's worn, torn clothes, set them into the small tub, and began to wash them gently. Sophie sat still with her eyes closed, her face calm and content, like a kitten warming itself beside a fireplace. Ethan giggled and slapped at the water, sending droplets flying. His laughter filled the tiny bathroom, so clear and sweet that Scarlett had to turn her face away so he wouldn't see his mother crying. It had been so long since she'd heard that sound from her son, so long since she'd seen Ethan happy instead of coughing and shaking. She bathed them carefully, washed their hair with the motel shampoo, scrubbed each small finger, each grimy crease, each foot blackened by days without a real wash. Then she wrapped them in white towels, dressed them in their old clothes, now dry, and laid them on the bed. The mattress wasn't soft like the bed in a 5-star hotel, but compared to the icy concrete floor of the shelter or the frozen ground outside, it felt like clouds. Sophie held her brother's hand. Ethan curled up against his sister, and within minutes both of them slipped into sleep. A deep, peaceful sleep. No coughing, no moaning from the cold, no fear lurking in the dark. Scarlett pulled the blanket up snug around them, then quietly went to the chair by the window. Outside, snow kept falling, white flakes drifting in the pale yellow glow of the streetlights. She looked down at the black card in her hand, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. There were still more than 20 hours left. More than 20 hours with unlimited money. What could she do with that kind of time? Her mother's voice sounded in her mind, warm and gentle the way it had been when she was alive. When a blessing comes to you, let it flow through you to someone else. Don't ever be the stopping place for kindness, my girl. Be the bridge that carries it farther. Scarlett smiled, a sad smile, but full of resolve. Her mother had lived her whole life like that, always giving even when she had nothing, always sharing even when she was the one in need. And now, for the first time in her life, Scarlett had a chance to do the same on a larger scale. She found a notepad and a pen on the nightstand, left behind by a previous guest. She began to write, her handwriting rough in the dim light of the bedside lamp. Margaret at the Mercy Street shelter. The heating system had been broken for 2 weeks. Someone would freeze to death this winter if it wasn't fixed. Harold the veteran needed diabetes medicine. She had bought it for him, but the shelter needed so much more than that. The Morrison family, Linda and her 3 small children, about to be thrown out because they were 4 months behind on rent. The children at the shelter needed warm coats, needed shoes, needed school supplies. The soup kitchen needed food. The free clinic needed medicine. The list grew longer and longer, and Scarlett realized 24 hours would never be enough to help everyone. But she would try. She would do everything she could in that time. She looked back at her 2 children sleeping, their chests rising and falling in steady rhythm, and a fierce determination surged in her chest. 24 hours, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling and steady at the same time. How many lives can I change in 24 hours? She folded the paper, tucked it into her coat pocket, and for the first time in 6 months, she wanted morning to come quickly. Scarlett woke before dawn, when the first light of a new day was only beginning to show along Chicago's horizon. She gently woke Sophie and Ethan, dressed them in the clothes that had dried overnight, and the 3 of them left the motel when the clock read 6 in the morning. The snow had stopped falling,